What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo with part 2 of Fantasy Scouting School. We're talking about how to evaluate the running back position today. As you can see going across the bottom of the screen right now, our draft guide is officially 50% off right now. You can get the whole thing for $15 at thefantasystockexchange.com. So if you enjoy this video and you want more rookie content, more dynasty content, head on over, check out that video, watch the video on the homepage so you can see all the features that are going to be in the draft guide. And if you enjoyed this video, as always, like, comment, subscribe. Now let's get into it. This is the one. This is the cream of the crop. The running back position in the NFL is probably the least important position of any position group of actual NFL football. Well, it's the most important thing in fantasy football. CMC, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, these players are the guys that win us leagues. And the interesting thing that I find is that nobody actually tells you how to spot these guys. And as I talked about for quarterbacks, and as I talked about for the other, as I'll talk about for the other positions, there's 4 major components to evaluating any position. You have film and analytics within the pre-draft umbrella, which is the current process that we're in right now. And then you have the draft capital and landing spot metrics within the post-draft umbrella. So all of these areas are going to take some time to evaluate. We're going to start with pre-draft because that's the process that we're currently in. Film and analytics. For each position, they differ what matters for each. And we're going to start with analytics because what matters for running backs to have success is very quantifiable. It's very easy to look at some benchmarks that we have and determine right away if this guy needs to be an outlier or if he fits a prototype. I want to establish these benchmarks that have been proven to be predictive for fantasy success because unlike the quarterback position, there actually has been a number of metrics that are much more predictive compared to the quarterback position, because in the quarterback video, as I mentioned, such a complex situation for each individual quarterback that there's no one metric or a couple metrics that have been predictive. So in the last 3 seasons, to find these benchmarks, I took a sample of all of the RB1s, meaning the guys that actually finished in the top 12 in points per game. And using the benchmarks that I found from this data set, here's generally what you want to see a college running back have. 1, you want to see them have good size. 19 of the 23 RB1s over the past 3 seasons weighed over 205 pounds, with many of the elite ones, so the Saquons, the Dalvin Cooks, the Jonathan Taylors, weighing between 210 and 230. So that's the ideal kind of weight that you want to see them have. Height isn't really as important as weight. Weight is more so the predictive metric. And number 2 is speed. The weight-adjusted speed score metric available on Player Profiler, as you can see on the screen, it played a big part for running backs. 18 of the 23 running backs that finished as an RB1 over the last 3 years had a weight-adjusted speed score above 95, with most of the elite assets, again, the Saquons, the Jonathan Taylors, having 110 or better. So this is a metric. Being big and fast actually did matter for the running back position, not so much for receivers, maybe some other position groups, but if you're big and fast, it definitely helps your chances of success at running back. And it makes sense because to be an RB1, you need to basically achieve your ceiling, and those are some of the higher ceiling players. 3 is draft capital. 16 of the 23 running backs were top 3 round picks in the 2000 whatever draft that they went into. So it's pretty common for all positions. You get a higher opportunity at a chance at a starting job if you're a higher draft pick. So again, I'm going to hammer this home for every position group. Draft capital matters. 4th is college target share. This is the only production-based one, but it has been the most predictive of running back success. 17 of the 23 RB1s had a college target share of over 8%. And 2 of the guys that we didn't have actual data for were Austin Eckler and James Robinson, both of whom are actually good receivers. So I would honestly just bump that up to 19 of 23. And basically what that means is that RBs involved in the receiving game are always coveted. It's always a big deal. And it's the reason some of these guys are able to finish as RB1s. And it's the reason even guys like Tariq Cohen and James White have RB1 type seasons under their belt. All right, so those were purely qualitative factors for the most part, with a little bit of production in there that we want to establish before anything, mainly to decide if a player is worth betting on or digging into their film altogether. And what I mean by this is if you go through these benchmarks for a prospect that you maybe, for example, I'll use Puka Williams from Kansas State just because he is an outlier. If you go through these benchmarks, you're going to notice that Puka Williams is 170 pounds. For him to have success in the NFL, he would have to be a massive, massive outlier. Like you might think Austin Eckler is a small running back. Austin Eckler's 205. Like, that is a huge difference. 170 pounds, that's like how much I weigh. That's completely outlier status for a running back to be successful in the NFL. So he's a guy. And if I saw any kind of outlier situations like that, another one is Jarrett Patterson, who has literally like no receiving production. If you spot something like that, I would just suggest waiting till these guys get drafted, see what their actual draft capital is. And if they get drafted highly, then you dig into them, because for them to be successful in the NFL, they just have to be extreme outliers. That is probably not likely and could be a waste of your time. When it comes to film evaluation, we're going to get into film next. There's a thread that I put out in January talking about Travis Etienne, outlining my film process for the running back position and the accompanying metrics that you can use to evaluate and determine if what you saw on film was indeed correct. So, as with all positions in the draft class databases are in this draft guide to help you compare the prospects amongst each other. And some of the stats are from paid resources, as I've mentioned, that are available to use for only a fraction of the price that you paid for this draft guide. So, if you want to know who was the most elusive running back in this draft class and you don't want to watch film, for example, maybe you don't have time, you can go to the draft class database and just check who stacked up as the most elusive. Answer's Javonte Williams, by the way, this past season. So, how to find film. I talked about this with the quarterback position. For the running back position, it's the same kind of process. To find film on the players, I highly suggest consulting the databases we provide in this draft guide, as well as searching for film on YouTube in the following order. First, check for all 22. For running backs especially, all 22 is extremely helpful to have if you can find it. So if you search for the team name or the offense or the offensive line versus all 22, you might be able to find some of that, especially for the higher end schools. So if you search for Ohio State offensive line versus, and then put all 22 at the end of that, you might be able to find a game or two of all 22 film. And I would highly suggest watching that game regardless of how the player performed, just because all 22 is really helpful to be able to see the way a running back is able to diagnose plays and all that kind of stuff. So if that isn't available, though, you could search directly for the player's name and probably get a cut up of some kind. But I highly suggest watching the whole offense if you can. So if you're trying to watch Trey Sermon, for example, and you search Ohio State offense, you'll probably get the plays where Trey Sermon, one, wasn't on the field, so you can just skip over those. But two, you'll get the plays where Trey Sermon wasn't getting the ball. And that's important to see him running routes. It's important to see him in pass protection. All these things matter for running backs. It's not necessarily how you run or catch the ball all the time. You need to be able to get open when you're running routes and protect the quarterback when you're in protection. So you can do all that and find the film that you're looking for. As far as what games to watch, if you don't know, like this guy, like Travis Etienne and Najee Harris, for example, they've been in college so long, it's hard to kind of maybe know which games are important to watch. If you're an NFL caliber running back, I don't give a flying fuck that you went for 220 yards and 4 touchdowns against Southern Miss. You should be doing that if you're an NFL caliber running back. So I immediately, especially for running backs, I immediately prioritize the best competition. I will watch every game of the best competition, especially if you went to, like for someone like Travis Etienne, for example, if he went to Clemson, then I don't even care what he did against the other ACC schools that are not on Clemson's level. I want to see what you did against Notre Dame. I want to see what you did against Alabama. I want to see what you did against Georgia. Teams that you played in like the college football playoff or potentially the ACC championship. Like those are the only games I care about, because your team is way more talented than every other team in your conference. So I really don't care that you went off against Pitt. If they have basically, so another thing that you want to be looking for is you want to find game film on both sides of the spectrum. I talked about this for quarterbacks, but I'll pull up Travis Etienne's game logs right now just to give you an example. So you can see on the screen right now, I would watch his best statistical game against a decent school to start. So I'd immediately prioritize that second Notre Dame game that you can see there in week 11. So week 11, he went 10 for 124 and 1 touchdown, 3 catches for 12 yards. I would watch that game because that was a pretty good statistical performance. And vice versa, I would also watch his worst statistical performance against a good opponent. And that was coincidentally another game against Notre Dame in week 8, where he went 18 for 28 and 1 touchdown, 8 for 57 through the air. That game is pretty solid indication of kind of how he was stuffed in the running lanes and stuff like that. But he didn't have Trevor Lawrence for that game, but that's besides the point. So there's no right way to select what games you want to watch. I generally want to watch 5 games for running backs, prioritizing good competition and try and get a highlight game where they performed really well and a low light game where they didn't perform so well. So now that we've established how to do that, how to find the film and what to watch, What we're going to say now is what to look for in film and analytics. The key areas, and there are 6 of them that I directly correlate to fantasy production for running backs. And if you saw the thread on ETN, you're probably going to know what areas I prioritize. The first area is elusiveness, and I think this is the single most important metric that a running back can be good in. When you look at, if you guys are familiar with Graham Barfield, you know that he does the yards created column where he basically stacks up all these running backs based on their ability to make people miss. And there's a reason that's been so predictive. It's because elusiveness translates. So when you're watching for this on film, what you're looking for is, can they make people miss? And running backs can do it in different ways. They don't have to have jump cuts. They don't have to have just completely nasty dead legs. They can do it in different ways. And the one thing you just want to see is them do it. Can you notice them making people miss in the holes, in space, whatever the case is? And the metrics that you can use to evaluate this, as I mentioned, they're all available in the draft guide for every position. There's a tab under the elusiveness part that says PFF elusive rating and tackles avoided per attempt. Those are the 2 most important metrics to use to evaluate it. Again, you want to watch these guys on film, see it happen, but then you also want to check the numbers to see, oh man, this guy looks like the most elusive running back in the class, in Javonte Williams, for example, and then you check the database that we have there, and you can see, yes, he was in fact the most elusive running back in the class this past season. So number 2 is contact balance. Another one, just an absolutely fundamental trait that a running back has to have. If you cannot break contact, that severely limits your fantasy potential. You can see from guys like Nyheim Hines, for example, he's good at a lot of other things, but he can't break contact. So he's not a guy that's overly consistent in fantasy and is reliant completely on big plays and scoring touchdowns. So contact balance. Can the guy break initial contact? When you're watching him on film in a wide open running lane, I don't care that he can just run a straight line for a 70-yard touchdown. Can he actually break some people off in the process of that 70-yard touchdown is the important part, right? So the way you can actually measure this in terms of the databases that we have is yards after contact per attempt. It's really the only stat you need. The amount of yards you're creating after contact is really indicative of your ability to stay on your feet after you're facing some heavy contact. So the third trait that we're going to get into, and honestly, I would argue that this is the most important to a ceiling of a fantasy player, because you can be a great fantasy player without having this, but to be the truly elite guys, to be the Dalvin Cooks, the Alvin Kamaras, the Christian McCaffreys, you need to be able to catch the ball. And you need to have not only be able to catch the ball, you need to be able to run routes and make things happen after the catch. So when you're watching someone in context of their receiving ability, you want to see them, one, catch the ball naturally, make sure they look normal when they catch the ball. You want to see them running routes, and you want to see them running just more than check down routes too. You want to see them running angle routes and wheel routes and stuff downfield. Maybe they're split into the slot or out wide. That's all important for receiving ability. And you also want to see them, what they do after they catch the ball. Are they able to quickly secure the ball, turn upfield, make some people miss, maybe pick up a first down, maybe make a big play or two? Like, that's what you want to see out of those guys. And the best example of that is what ETN and Najee Harris do in this class. Those are the 2 guys that are able to have a complete receiving game. I would say Michael Carter from North Carolina also kind of fits this description as well. Kenneth Gainwell from Memphis. These guys are all good receiving backs. And Javonte Williams in his own right is pretty solid. But the way to measure this in terms of metrics that you want to marry with the film are receiving production. So what they did in college, targets and receptions. I would say a good benchmark for someone who is probably a good receiving back is to look for a season where they had 20 plus receptions. That has typically been a benchmark for someone who's been good collegiate production wise in the receiving game. Yards after catch per reception, again, another important statistic. You want to be able to make things happen after the catch, and yards per route run is probably the most important to measure the receiving ability of a college running back. If you have a high yards per route run, you basically did everything I just mentioned. To get a high yards per route run, you obviously had to, 1, catch the ball. 2, you had to be able to make things happen after the catch. And 3, you probably created some huge explosive plays to help pad that stat as well. So all of those things go into yards per route run, and that's why it's very important. So the next thing that we're going to get into is not exactly translatable to fantasy points necessarily, but it is translatable to getting on the field more, which is translatable to fantasy points. Obviously, the best assets in fantasy are on the field 70, 80% of the time at the running back position. So what we want to know is, can you stay on the field on third down? And what that means is, 1, can you catch the ball, obviously? And 2, are you good in pass protection? And we're not NFL scouts. Remember this. So the people that I talk about, we're all fantasy players. We're not necessarily looking for technique in pass protection when we're watching them. we want to see, is it effective? Yes or no? Like basically, are they getting in the guy's way? Are they affecting the linebacker or the corner that's blitzing? Because NFL coaches, when they see effort, when they see willingness to do it, when they see a player being physical, maybe their technique isn't perfect, but that's the NFL coach's job to teach them the technique. So just because a player doesn't have proper technique or whatever you deem proper technique at the college level doesn't mean they're going to develop in that area. And that might take a little longer, obviously. So I do kind of discuss technique in my player cards and some of my evaluations, but it's only from a matter of like, just because a guy has bad technique doesn't mean he's never going to learn it, basically. It just might take him a little longer than someone who has good technique. So the ways you can measure this in our draft guide are pass blocking efficiency, pass blocking snaps, and pass blocking percentage. So you want to see, one, how good are they at it? Efficiency meaning like, did they allow a quarterback pressure? Did they allow a quarterback hurry, quarterback hit, a sack? And then pass blocking snaps and pass blocking percentage. You want to know how often were they trusted in actually being in pass protection. And generally speaking, the higher the pass blocking percentage, the more they were trusted in that role and the more they're likely to be trusted in the NFL as well. So the next area we're going to talk about, scoring ability. Can you put points on the board in the red zone? This is obviously very important for fantasy. Touchdowns are usually the way that we win fantasy titles. If you had Alvin Kamara this past year, you probably know what I'm talking about. Touchdowns, the easiest way to measure them and a player's ability to score at the next level is how many touchdowns they score in college and how many touchdowns per game did they score in college. Because some guys just have a nose for the end zone. It's not really something you can measure. It's just something that they make happen. Whether they're on the 10-yard line, they have a way to find themselves into the end zone, whether they're on the 1-yard line, whether they're on the 40-yard line. Some guys just have a nose for the end zone, and it's an important trait to have because we've seen from guys like Alvin Kamara, as I mentioned, from guys like Aaron Jones, touchdowns can carry your fantasy production if you're very good at scoring them. And it is a skill. It's not just necessarily a product of your offense and your quarterback, although that obviously does help. To the next area that we're going to talk about, and this one, again, is not 100% necessary because we've seen great fantasy assets that don't have this, but that's home run speed. Does this player that I'm watching have the potential to take a play 80-plus yards? Or maybe not even 80-plus yards? Do they have the ability to consistently break off those 20, 30-yard gains, maybe as a receiver or in the run game as well? So basically, if you look at guys like Le'Veon Bell, he didn't have this. So he was able to be an elite running back without having this breakaway speed. But obviously, if he had this breakaway speed, he might have been even more so of an elite running back. So when you look at this class, you have guys like Travis Etienne, Michael Carter, Kenneth Gainwell. All these guys have the breakaway speed that you're looking for, whereas someone like Najee Harris doesn't necessarily have that breakaway speed. But it doesn't mean that Najee Harris is a bad fantasy asset just because he doesn't have top-end speed. It's only one component. I would argue this is the least important of the 6 that I talked about. So just because Najee Harris doesn't have it doesn't mean he's not going to be a good fantasy asset. And of course, all of the other aspects of playing running back that you may be able to evaluate are important as well. And what I mean by this is that as much as vision is important, someone's running back vision, most people cannot determine when they're watching film what constitutes good vision on a play, and including myself. I might think a guy ran with bad vision on a play, but I don't know what the play call was. I don't know what he was supposed to be doing. I don't know what the blocking scheme was. So what he might have been doing might have been exactly what his coaches told him to do. And maybe his left guard, for example, whiffed on a block, and that's why it wasn't effective. So when you see people talking about a running back has bad vision, a running back has bad this, bad that you can't actually quantify, I put a lot less stock into that because as much as those things are important, I do think you can evaluate those things. They are very subjective, right? So there's no metrics to measure one guy's vision over another and if it matters for fantasy production altogether. So my advice is to follow the 6 traits that I just outlined when watching these players, and anything else that they have is a bonus, right? So, or it's a stylistic thing, right? A guy who looks really smart, he looks like he's really football intelligent, that's a bonus. It's not necessarily translatable to fantasy production. A guy who has really good vision, again, that's a bonus. A guy who's really tough, he's really physical, again, bonus. It's not necessarily translates. You're not being like, oh yeah, this guy looked really tough on all of his runs, and 10 out of the last 12 running backs in top 12 fantasy scoring were also looking very tough on their runs. Like it just doesn't make any sense. They're all subjective qualities to improve a prospect's profile as a whole. But the 6 fundamental things that you want to talk about, maybe 5.5 if you want to include home run ability as being optional, those are the ones that I would start with if you're looking to watch these players and evaluate them from an analytics perspective as well. So as I mentioned, there's 2 components. There's pre-draft and post-draft. We are in the pre-draft process. After April 29th of this year, we will be in the post-draft process, meaning we know where everyone went. As for all positions, landing spot matters tremendously, and a big determining factor of how good or how bad a landing spot is for the running back position is draft capital. As I mentioned in the intro portion, draft capital is very predictive in allowing these players to produce at a high level, mainly due to the increase in trust and opportunity that you have from a coaching staff. We hear this all the time, but coaches and GMs lie all the time. Basically, when they're asked about things, if you watch a press conference of a head coach right now in the offseason, they're going to get asked like a million questions. Like, for example, my own team, Bruce Arians is always asked, like, what do you think of bringing back Chris Godwin? What do you think of that position? What do you think of this position? And for the most part, Bruce Arians is a pretty honest coach, but he'll say things like, oh, yeah, we really like what we have at this position. We're not really looking to upgrade or whatever. And then April comes around and they draft a running back in the second round, right? Like that's just what coaches do. The draft is one area where coaches and GMs cannot lie. They're telling you what they think of their position groups, what they think of their offense, what they think of their defense. So Pittsburgh, for example, can talk all offseason about how they don't need a running back. And if they draft Najee Harris this coming year in the 20s, then they obviously were lying all offseason and they did need a running back. So they showed their hand basically, and you'll know right away that Najee will get a feature workload if he was a first-round pick of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the other portion of this, aside from draft capital, is landing spot and the actual surrounding factors as well. So don't worry, once these guys are actually drafted, me and Danny and everyone else on our channel will be going in depth on offensive line situations, surrounding weapons, coaching tendencies, all of that, how good the quarterback is, all of that we will be going over to determine how good the landing spot is for every running back and every wide receiver, every quarterback and every tight end in this draft class. So obviously a player that lands in an offense like San Francisco, for example, with a great offensive line, weapons on the outside, probably a quarterback upgrade coming, and more importantly, a scheme and a coaching staff that knows how to use running backs and knows the best way to deploy running backs, is going to be more player-friendly than a scheme like the Jets, who has a downgraded version of every factor I just mentioned. They don't have that good of an offensive line. They have Sam Darnold, as of right now, a quarterback or potentially a rookie quarterback. And their coaching staff, while is improved, is not necessarily proven to be good for fantasy running backs like the 49ers. So all of that kind of stuff kind of works its way into the equation for evaluating a landing spot. So this is about half the battle as well. I would say it's not as important for a running back as it is for a quarterback to land in a good spot. I don't think any position is as important as a quarterback. But just because I like Michael Carter, for example, I'll just use him as an example because he is a guy that I really like in this class. I'll change my tune about Michael Carter if he gets 5th-round draft capital to a team that doesn't have much of a workload open, or maybe he's going to be a committee back behind someone that maybe is a feature running back or something like that. If he, like, for example, people like Darrington Evans last year probably don't really like him anymore because he went to Tennessee behind Derrick Henry, where you literally are not getting the ball because Derrick Henry gets the ball every play. So if a guy goes to a team with a bad coach, bad draft capital, bad play caller, like you have to be able to pivot. You can't just hold on to your draft grades. If Travis Etienne, who is my #1 running back, goes to a far worse situation than Najee Harris and Javonte Williams, I have no problem moving those guys ahead of Travis Etienne. Just because I like the talent better doesn't necessarily mean he's going to achieve the ceiling that I see for him. He needs to land in a good spot for that to happen. So all of these factors are equally important. Very few running backs will check all of these from a film perspective, from the analytical benchmarks that I talked about, from the landing spot to the draft capital. But the more a player can check, the better. And I already talked about which ones are more important than the others. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of my mindset when I'm evaluating running backs and how you can adopt some of the ways that I evaluate and watch these guys for yourself if you have the time to do so. Make sure to check out all of the other videos in this series about all the other positions, and also check out the databases of stats relating to the 4 positions as well, so that you can, even if you don't have time to watch these players, get a good kind of bird's eye view of what each of these running backs bring to the table and their potential for fantasy success. So peace out, guys. Enjoy the rest of the guide.